At 6:11 a.m. on July 27, 1945, a tractor sat silent in a field of gold. The war in Europe had ended, but for one farmer in central Texas, the battle wasn't over. His enemy wasn't a soldier. It was a dead engine. The man was Thomas Reed, 47 years old, worn down by 6 years of drought, rationing, and the endless waiting for letters from sons fighting overseas. That morning, his John Deere Model B refused to start. The wheat stood ready, 2 days from over-ripening, and black clouds were crawling across the horizon. If he lost the harvest, he'd lose the farm. Working beside him were 12 men wearing faded khaki uniforms stenciled with 2 black letters, PW, prisoner of war. They were Germans captured in Tunisia 2 years earlier, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through camps in Oklahoma, then sent here to Texas to replace the American laborers gone to war. Behind the fence line, a guard leaned on his rifle, already sweating in the morning heat. The prisoners said little. They had learned that silence was safest. One of them, a thin mechanic named Karl Weber, crouched near the tractor's wheel hub. He was 27 from Stuttgart, once employed in a Daimler factory building aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. His hands still carried the memory of tools, the rhythm of machines. Now those same hands hauled sacks of grain under the Texas sun. Reed slammed the hood shut, muttering a curse that crossed language barriers. The guard smirked. Karl hesitated, then stepped forward. "Sir," he said carefully, his accent thick, "I can fix." Reed looked up, half amused, half angry. "You? You can fix this?" Karl nodded once. "Engines are same anywhere." Reed studied the prisoner, thin, calm, eyes that had seen too much, and finally gestured toward the tractor. "Fine. But if you break it worse, you'll be pulling that plow yourself." Karl smiled faintly and went to work. In 1945, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war. Nearly 50,000 lived in Texas. Their camps dotted the countryside from Hearne to Hereford, from Camp Bowie near Brownwood to small branch compounds hidden behind cotton fields. They lived under the Geneva Convention. Decent food, medical care, even pay, 80 cents a day. Locals were suspicious at first. Some saw murderers, others saw free labor. But as months passed, curiosity replaced fear. Farmers discovered that many of these men weren't soldiers by choice. They were bakers, teachers, mechanics, drafted, defeated, stranded, half a world away. By the summer of 1945, those POWs had harvested more than 1 million acres of crops that would have otherwise rotted in the fields. And somewhere in that endless sea of wheat was Thomas Reed's small farm and the silent tractor that threatened to destroy it. Karl lifted the hood again. The air smelled of gasoline and dust. He ran his fingers along the ignition wire, cracked. The magneto-coil, fractured. No spare parts, no store open for miles. He turned to the farmer. "Need wire." Metal wire, Reed frowned. "For what?" Karl pointed to the fence line. "That will do." The guard laughed. "He wants to fix a tractor with barbed wire." But Reed waved him silent. "Let him try." Karl borrowed a pair of pliers, stripped the insulation, and cut a short length of wire. He wrapped it around the broken coil, twisting it tight until it sang like a string. Then he took a nail from the barn wall, ground it against the stone step, and slid it into the coil as a makeshift contact point. His movements were methodical, the same care a watchmaker gives to springs. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking the faded cloth of his uniform. At 6:47, he nodded. "Try now." Reed pulled the crank once. Nothing. Twice. A cough, a puff of black smoke. Third pull. The engine caught, sputtered, then roared into life. For 3 seconds no one moved. Then the guard let out a shout. The prisoners of war cheered. Reed stared, speechless. The machine that had defied him for 2 days now idled smoothly, held together by scrap metal, and the hands of a man the world had called his enemy. That evening, Reed did something no regulation manual covered. He asked the guard if the men could eat at the house. The sergeant shrugged. "Your wrist, sir." Inside the farmhouse, the table was long and plain. Mrs. Reed served cornbread, beans, and strong coffee. The German sat stiffly, unsure whether to speak. Karl studied the oil lamp's flame like it was something holy. Conversation began slow, then found its rhythm. Reed talked about the war's end, about his sons, one in France, one missing in the Philippines. Karl spoke softly of Stuttgart, of nights when the air raid sirens howled and the city burned. At one point, Reed's little boy brought a toy truck to Karl and asked him to fix it. Karl laughed and tightened the axle with a nail. For a moment, the room felt lighter. Outside, thunder rolled over the plains, but inside, something small and human had been repaired too. The next morning, the tractor started on the first pull. They worked from sunrise to sunset. When the storm hit, the last wagons rolled under cover. Wheat safe, season saved. News spread through the camp. The German fixed the American's farm. Guards joked about recruiting him for the Army Corps of Engineers. The other prisoners teased Karl, calling him Herr John Deere. 2 months later, the U.S. Army began shipping prisoners home. Karl's name was on transport number 217, bound for New York. He spent his final day on the farm, repairing tools he knew he'd never use again. Reed drove out to say goodbye. They shook hands, firm, silent. Reed handed him a small photograph of the family standing beside the tractor. "If you ever make it back," he said, "there'll be work waiting." Karl looked at the picture for a long time. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me feel useful again." Karl's journey home took 31 days by sea. When the ship docked at Bremerhaven, the shoreline looked like the surface of the moon. Flattened cities, silent cranes, children scavenging for coal. He walked through Stuttgart with his hands deep in empty pockets. The factory where he had once worked was a blackened shell. His parents' apartment was gone. Neighbors told him they hadn't survived the bombing of March 1944. Karl found work repairing bicycles, then tractors brought in from rural towns. He rented a small workshop and painted his name above the door, Weber Machine and Service. On the wall, he hung one photograph, the reeds, the tractor, and the open Texas sky. When customers asked about it, he only said, "A friend who taught me how to fix things properly." In May 1947, a brown envelope arrived at the Reed farm. Inside was a short letter, written in careful English. "Dear Mr. Reed, I hope the harvest was good this year. I am home. Germany is broken, but alive. When I fix engines, I still hear Texas wind. Thank you for the day you trusted me. Karl Weber." Mrs. Reed framed it and kept it on the mantel. Over the years, the ink faded, but the words never lost their weight. Decades passed. Camp Bowie was torn down, replaced by housing developments. Most people forgot that enemy soldiers had once walked those roads, but in barns and tool sheds across Texas, the legacy remained. Tractors repaired by German hands that still ran smoother than anyone expected. In 1984, a journalist from Dallas was writing about POW camps. He found Thomas Reed Jr., now an old man with rough hands and a memory like a ledger. When asked about the story, Reed Jr. smiled and led the reporter to the barn. Inside sat the same John Deere tractor, its paint faded but the wire repair still in place. He pulled the crank once. The engine coughed, sputtered, then started. Reed Jr. patted the hood and said quietly, "Still works." Guess he fixed more than just metal that day. Across Texas, the descendants of those POWs built lives far from home. A few returned after the war as immigrants, married local women, opened businesses. Karl Weber never did. He died in 1972, buried in Stuttgart. When his nephew cleared the shop, he found that same photograph still hanging above the workbench. On the back, written in German, were 5 words: Frieden beginnt mit Vertrauen. Peace begins with trust. If you listen closely in those quiet Texas fields, you can still hear the hum of that old engine and the echo of a moment when an enemy's hands turned a wrench and a nation's heart turned with it.